So today, for this webinar, we are joined by Sally Miller, a project manager for the local food and farm co-ops. Sally has worked extensively in sustainable food and agriculture co-ops for almost 25 years in both Canada and the US. Sally was kind enough to join us today to discuss the impacts of the choices we make in consuming, growing, and processing foods, and to look at the ways that innovators are changing the system for the benefit of the people and the planet. Sally, if you'd like, you can take control of the computer and begin your presentation.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I will get the presentation started. So I'm assuming if people can't hear me, Allison will let me know.
Of course.
Of course. So I think it's fitting that we're meeting on an unseasonably warm day in Southern Ontario to talk about planet-friendly food and farms. I'm going to note just right at the beginning that some of the material I'm going to be covering comes from a international project on sustainable food systems that I did with Wilfrid Laurier University. It was supported by Carasso Foundation and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So what I'm going to do first is talk about the contributions of food and farming to climate change. So how it's actually increased climate change across the planet. I'm going to do a bit looking at the overview of the food system to make sure that people understand what parts of our economy are engaged in the food system. I'll give some more information about the impact of food and farming on the climate. And then I'm going to talk about what we can do and what we are doing and give some examples of some of the incredible innovations that are already happening. So without more ado, I will get started. So first, the food system. So I'm going to just talk about the carrot. So consider the carrot. I think that we often think that the food system is very linear. So it goes from the left-hand side of your screen there, it goes from the field with the carrots growing. That's just north of Toronto and some of the best soil in Canada. And then it gets on a truck and it goes to a retail store in the third picture there, and then it ends up on your plate. And if you didn't know it already, carrot greens are edible. But in fact, that's not how it is. It's more like this. So in Canada, 20% of our carrots are exported. They don't actually go onto our plates. So they're going to the US, but they may also be going to Europe and Japan and places like that. So at the same time, 25% of the carrots in Canada are imported. So we have 20% going out, 25% coming back. This is called redundant trade. It means the same thing's going out that's coming back. Obviously not a rational way to do it. Some carrots are also exported and then imported again. So this is a picture of baby carrots, which you're probably familiar with. There is basically one facility in North America that makes baby carrots. You may know this, but baby carrots are no longer baby carrots. They're actually sculpted from adult carrots. And this is done in California, but some of them may be grown here, particularly when the drought in California was going on. California didn't have enough of their own adult carrots to shape into these baby carrots. So I know farmers who were shipping from north of Toronto to California to have the carrots shaped into these baby carrots, and they were brought back to us as baby carrots. So this is the food system is, as I'm saying, is very complicated, but also there's something irrational about it. So you may have heard that the average meal has traveled 1,500 miles to your plate in Canada, but that is probably not considering this sort of back and forth thing that's happening where things are actually going all the way to California and then coming back to us. So look at the food system impact on the planet in general. I took this pie chart actually from research in the United Kingdom, but Canada would be very similar. So this shows that the contributions of all greenhouse gas emissions, and this is to remember that it's not just carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere by agriculture and food, but it's also significantly methane, especially from livestock cultivation, and also nitrous oxide from things like the fertilizer. So what you're seeing there is that 18.4% of global emissions in the UK are coming from food and agriculture. The estimates of the global emissions from food and agriculture vary. 24% is the one that I've heard most recently that would be slightly updated. So it is apparently increasing. So if you break this down just into food and agriculture, you see that 40% of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from food and agriculture, 40% are coming from agriculture. almost 12% coming from food manufacturing, so that's processing after it's come out of the field. And then retail is 5%. Now, if you look at energy use, which is also extremely important to climate change impact, energy use is actually probably higher. It's very high in processing because it's very large machines, and then processing often means long-term storage. So you had the coolers, the large coolers. Retail, also very high energy use because of the large coolers, and as you know, in supermarkets, the coolers are often open, which is although it's makes it more likely for people to buy the produce, it's an incredible sort of waste of the cooling energy going off that display. Also, the contributions of food production vary by which sector you're talking about. So the livestock sector is 70% of global land use is the production of meat. 18% of global emissions of methane and nitrous oxide are coming from the production of meat. Meat and dairy, in fact, are responsible for 8% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. So this is one reason that many of the mitigation ideas are to get people to reduce their consumption of meat. Even just going, if everybody went in the week, going with one meat-free day, it would make an enormous difference to our climate. So in food and agriculture, there's a series of subsectors which are the contributors to climate change, starting with inputs at the farm and the production, how the energy and the emissions from the tractors and the machinery, the cost of the storage, as I mentioned, the emissions and the energy use for keeping things cool so that you can have the same product year round. So for instance, you don't just get apples during the harvest season in the fall. They are stored for months and months and months, and you will see them showing up throughout the year in your supermarket. And then the supermarket, as I said, has these very open refrigerated shelves. And in consumption, there's also a fair amount of energy use and emissions, and also 51% of the waste in the food system comes from household consumption, which means that all of the emissions and energy that went into the product is then not even necessary because the food isn't eaten. And the complex supply chains that I mentioned before, where things are going out to be processed in the US and then coming back to be sold in Canada, again, increasing the contribution to climate impact. So in each sector, there are different impacts. So this is looking at production. This is actually a Mennonite orchard. And the climate change contributions in the production come from the inputs. They do come from storage. A lot of farmers do a fair amount of storage as well. And then there's the question of what kind of fertilizers are used, and whether those fertilizers are really being used sustainably, so they're staying in the land, or if they're being drained off in the water. Processing, again, here's this is an apple processing plant that's near Waterloo, and this is the kind of machinery that's used, so an enormous amount of energy, as well as waste from trying to keep a product that is harvested once a year going throughout the year in retail stores. The retail, as I've mentioned, large contributions to emissions, and then especially to energy use. One of the things that people are starting to think about is to get their food more directly, so skipping the retail phase and actually buying directly from farmers at farmers markets and things like that. And that reduces the need for this kind of cooling, lighting. Often you'll see retail stores leaving their doors open during the summer, so that all the air conditioning is also going outside to air condition the street as well. So then the other question is eating, as I said, eating closer to the sun, having a days when you're eating vegetable-focused meals, not as much meat, and that can make a huge difference. And globally, many diets in, for instance, in Asia and places like that, are very vegetable, have been traditionally very vegetable heavy. But as the rest of the world is reaching a similar economic level to North America and Europe and places like that, they are increasing their use of dairy and meat, and subsequently increasing the impact of their food habits on climate change, as well as getting food-related diseases that they've never had before, like obesity and diabetes. So one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that the healthy production of food comes from complex ecosystems that are balanced and complex. So what you're seeing here is actually a small-scale organic farm near London, Ontario. And in this case, they are growing a whole diversity of products. They have fairly short rows, which means that they're protecting the soil better. The water is not running off as much as it would in a very large farm with very long rows. And they have the sort of buffers of trees and things around, which are also good protectors. So I'm going to talk a bit about the climate change impacts now of our food system as it is. There's some alarming things that are going on. This is the Gulf of Mexico, and the white area that you're seeing is what is the so-called dead zone, which has been increasing over the years. It's very hard for the ocean ecosystem to recover from this. There's nothing growing in it, and it is a result of the agricultural pesticides, fertilizers that are washing down the Mississippi River and other waterways into the Gulf of Mexico and essentially killing the ocean ecosystem. Another effect in food and farming is that the volatile weather patterns that come from climate change mean that we are having more and more crop loss. So this is actually a photo of an apple farm similar to the Mennonite orchard that I showed at the beginning. And it is late in the season, and everything is covered with ice. This has been happening the last few years. We've lost anywhere from 25 to 50% of southern Ontario's apple crop because of a late frost. The late frost kills the blossoms, and the result is that the apple trees can't produce apples. Another global effect is that people who are relying on their local agriculture and subsistence agriculture are having increased droughts, longer droughts, multi-year droughts, and this is causing climate change refugees, which is people who are leaving areas where they can no longer grow food. They're on the move. The World Bank is predicting that there might be 143 million migrants. And this photo is actually, those are graves of children who were migrating and weren't able to make it. So this is having an impact more on vulnerable communities who may be doing subsistence agriculture. They don't have a lot of extra income or anything, and they need to be able to keep growing their own food. Another thing that's been happening from climate change is because of the volatile weather, very heavy rains, then increase in sort of extreme storms. We're seeing more breakdown of the transportation networks, which means the places that are getting food from the trucks driving from one place to another may not be able to do it. So recently, Trans-Canada Highway had a collapse like this right around Wawa, and that was one of the only ways to get between east and west, northeast Ontario and northwest Ontario. So there was a complete shutdown of transportation and a disruption of the food system that depended on that road. The other thing that's happening that we are not always aware of is that we think about global warming. We say the planet's going to increase in temperature by a certain number of degrees, but it's actually uneven. So there are places that are increasing much more, 5, 6, 7 degrees. So for instance, in the Arctic, we know that polar bears are, for instance, are really threatened right now. Because they rely on the ice to be able to hunt and get their food on the ice. They can swim, but not that far, so there have been drownings and things like that. So their whole access to food is changing, and that is because the Arctic is warming up faster than other places. This is the temperature map, the prediction of where we're going to be by 2051 to 2080 in Canada. And you can see that the change in temperature, again, is not even. So one of the things that scientists have discovered is that the middle of Canada is going to increase in temperature much more and to sort of dangerous levels. So when you're looking at 5 to 6 degrees of increase in temperature, you're looking at something where they're going to have pests, they're going to have a complete change that the ecosystem may not be able to respond to very quickly. Whereas when you're looking in southern Ontario, you're seeing less of a change. So this is something to remember. It's not even. Not only is it affecting vulnerable communities more, but it is also not even in our own country. So one of the effects on our food system is that we get increased blight and pest infestation as we have pests that have classically only been south of us. We have them moving now into the north as it gets warmer. This is a picture of the emerald ash forests of ash trees, because the emerald ash borer only dies when the weather is 30 below. And because we haven't been having those winter kills of the bug, it's been able to move farther north. In addition, because we do more monocropping in the agriculture, so we'll have just one crop, we're in great danger of losing entire parts of the food system because it's not diverse enough. So by planting, one kind of tree, if there's a pest that comes along that kills that tree, then we may lose much more than we would have lost if it was more scattered. We're also facing decreased agricultural yields. So this was the drought. This is a picture of the Holland Marsh, so the most productive area in absolutely the best soil in Canada. But we had a drought a couple of years ago. They lost 50% of the onion crop. They lost, I believe, a lot of the garlic crop, and you can see this beautiful soil is just devastated on the right-hand side of the screen, not producing anything. Climate change is also creating changes in fisheries harvest, reducing the First Nations ability to catch the fish that they have the license for. The part of the problem is that some fish species can move farther north as the ocean warms, but some of them can't, and that's where we're going to be losing out. Wild food impacts, we're especially looking at increased impact in the north, which means caribou, for instance, who have to travel on the ice to get to their birthing grounds every year, are looking at swimming rather than being able to cross the river on ice. Likewise, we've had some tundra lakes, which First Nations are dependent on for their fish, vanish overnight because the permafrost is melting. The tundras are just draining, and they've lost their traditional food source. This is a monoculture banana. Globally, the banana that we eat is called Cavendish. It's one variety, and there is a bug that goes after Cavendish. And because the plantations are large monocrops, it is possible that our global bananas, will be gone. So if you see other kinds of bananas, I encourage you to eat them. So what can we do? As I said, eating closer to the sun, considering a more plant-based diet. This is some things that can be grown. You can have sprouts year-round. You can do it in your house. You can, yeah, and you can also get some. They've got some beets, and we've got some root vegetables in there that do store well. The principle for agriculture actually is to keep your soil covered, and this is what Ralph Martin, a professor at the University of Guelph, always says. So when you see big bare patches of soil as you drive around, maybe in southern Ontario, these are very sad. This is some of the best soil in Canada. Having it bare all winter means that as we have increased storms, increased heavy rainfall, that soil is washing away. So the other thing about keeping it covered is that you can put in clover, which I believe is what this field is, and things like that, and those actually restore nutrients ready for next year's crop. Another thing that a lot of farmers are looking at is considering better ways to keep the water when it does fall on the property, keeping it and managing it. So on the left, you have a farm where it hasn't been managed, and it's developed these deep gullies. On the right, you have what's called contour farming, where they have actually designed the lines of the farm to match the landscape and the geography. And they do this often with GPS very carefully. And it allows the water to be retained and held for when it's needed by the plants. So even in the case of drought, the picture on the right, that farm would probably have access to water for quite a while. We can also look at sustainable production practices. So on the left, we've got a small fishery co-op that does delivery direct to consumers. And on the right, we've got an inland fishery, First Nations fishery, way up north, which is producing regional fish just for markets in their fly-in community. We were also looking at great urban agriculture models. I work a lot with co-ops, so I'm showing you co-op pictures. But on the left this is Many Feathers in Mississauga, which is an urban agriculture co-op. They're producing food which is going to people living with food insecurity issues, so people who are hungry, as well as going to the farmers. And then on the right, you have some pasture-fed chickens. So this is a very sustainable way to raise chickens. They're dropping the fertilizer down into the pasture where they're eating up the bugs and things like that. And the coop is moved around, and eventually they fertilize the whole farm. So it's a very excellent sort of system. So as we look at things that we can do, I think it's really important to think for climate change resilience is to think about projects that achieve more than one solution or innovation at a time. So not only dealing with water use, for instance, but maybe energy use, maybe reducing the distance of transport of food miles, maybe looking at smaller scale and diverse agriculture, as well as managing the water. So one of the things we need, as I said at the beginning, ecosystems are very complicated and in delicate balance. Our solutions need to be equally balanced and thoughtful. So a few examples. This is a retail store, the West End Food Co-op, which I helped to start. And we did, there's all kinds of things that we did. We used earth plaster on the walls. We actually have a production kitchen so that we're producing some of the food which is sold there rather than bringing it in from somewhere else. We have a lot of fresh vegetables so that people can eat closer to the sun. We're looking at heat retention from some of these machines so that when we're doing air conditioning or working the small cooler over on the right, these produce a lot of heating, actually, which is usually just lost to the air. And in a retail store, then you turn on the air conditioning to fight with that heat. And so there are systems where you can start catching that heat and using it in a much more planned and thoughtful fashion. So we're working on that. West End Food Co-op is in Toronto. And then I have a quick video here of the On the Move Organics, which is an extraordinary solution for distribution, combining a bunch of different solutions. So I'll show you this. It has some nice music, which you can't hear, but it doesn't have any words, so you won't be missing the words. So that was showing you one of our co-ops in London, Ontario, called On the Move Organics, and they have combined, as you saw, buying from a local diverse farm with, they actually have had alternative fuel vehicles. They do their deliveries by bicycle all over London. So they're addressing solutions to climate change and reducing their climate change impact in a whole range of different ways. And they've continued to produce, they have a local food restaurant, so I highly recommend you visit them. Another thing, as I said, for consumption, this is the West End Food Co-op's farmers market, and this is a very good solution where you've got the sun is lighting the market instead of using energy to light a retail store. You've got all the farmers bringing their stuff directly to the consumers, and so you've cut out a whole lot of pieces of the food system that would have led to emissions and energy use. So this is an excellent model. Farmers markets are happening all over the place. I'm sure there's some in your area. If not, I can help you start some. This is another example. Again, I'm saying that when we're thinking about looking at the projects that are solutions, we want to think about how to measure resilience. And this is to recognize, does the project have multiple impacts? Does it benefit more than one food system? Is it replicable? Can it be done in other areas? Is it scalable? Can it be made larger, reach more people? And does it have longevity? Will it continue to last? So this is a model similar to pasture-fed chicken, but with cows, where the cows are kept within that box in the tape. They eat away at the grasses in that area for a while. They produce the fertilizer for the farm, and then they are moved to another area and they continue to eat and produce fertilizer. So a very efficient system with multiple impacts. I have just a couple more cases. This is Mapleton's Dairy. You might have seen their ice cream in the store. This is one of the oldest organic farms in Ontario, and they have they've always done organic, but now they've actually shifted to really think about the resilience of everything they do. So they have a process where the cows are actually in very deep hay and compost, which means that it's very warm inside the barn just naturally because of the work of breaking down the hay. They can go out whenever they want. They actually have the ability to open the door for themselves. Apparently they tend to go out at sunset because they don't like the full sun on their backs. And they can also choose when to be milked. So over on the left, if you can't see it, there's a self-milking station where they just walk in and the machine recognizes which cow they are by a tag that they have, and it milks them and gives them a treat and lets them go. So many kinds of sustainability going on at this farm. Another example is the Kinloss Mennonite community, which is in southwestern Ontario. As you know, Mennonites are running their farms without the use of electricity. So what you're seeing there is a conventional tomato greenhouse with the tomatoes on the very long stalks, just like the greenhouses all over Ontario. But most greenhouses uses tremendous amount of energy to heat and light them. This is done entirely with the use of a wood boiler that heats water that's then pushed hydraulically around the greenhouse. Produces a tremendous number of tomatoes very sustainably. And then on the right is orchard, one of their orchards where they have done very dense planting, and that's actually a way to mitigate some of the late frosts and also to experiment because they grow more quickly when you're doing this dense planting. They can experiment with climate change resistant varieties and you know, come up with some new innovations that way. So that's it for me. I'm happy to answer questions.
Just unmuting myself. All right, thanks so much, Sally. So we did have a clarification come through while you were talking. And Pam was just wondering, the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, is that the result of pesticide runoff or nutrient loading and oxygen causing the life to die off, or is it a combination of the two?
So I mean, it's a good question. My understanding is that the cause is the runoff of pesticide runoff, but I think that's then connected to algae blooms, and yeah, you're right. So I think it's a part of the same thing. So it's probably both.
Yeah, working together.
Yeah.
So then Ainsley was, as a follow-up, was wondering if we're seeing similar dead zones forming in Canadian watersheds, such as the Great Lakes. Are you familiar with those issues?
I mean, my understanding is I have not heard of a dead zone exactly like that. But there is certainly a problem with runoff into the Great Lakes. I think some of the problems that we're seeing have more to do with things like the zebra mussels that are developing, which are an invasive species and are growing well in water that's not particularly clean, and it's wiping out it's taking out the niche that could be used for other species. There's also a difference. The Great Lakes, Lake Ontario, is not as clean as some of the other Great Lakes. It's sort of at the end of the series of water flows, and there's also been quite a lot of pollutants and heavy metals actually going in from manufacturing that was along the shore of Toronto. So, you know, you wouldn't be eating fish out of that were fished near Toronto.
I do believe I've heard of algae blooms being a serious issue within Lake Erie, especially closer to some of the agricultural communities.
Okay. Yep.
So we are seeing some impacts of nutrient loading within the Great Lakes, but probably not to the same extent as the Gulf of Mexico. Mary Lou Rickard has asked a question. She's wondering, can invasive species have a negative effect on dense planting? So I'm just going to go up.
Negative effect. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, Mary, if you could just clarify, and then we can revisit that one. We did have a question from Pam. She was wondering if you were able to speak to country of origin labeling, because like I know at one point you were mentioning, you know, things going back and forth across the border. I'm not sure how those would be labeled, but she was also curious why produce is labeled but not meat. Is that
I think that's a great question, actually. I've always wondered why produce is labeled and not meat. I mean, I think it's a matter of which things people started to pay attention to first, and probably also the fact that the meat is quite consolidated. So one of the problems with labeling meat is that there would be there'd be an abattoir. The meat can be coming from lots of different places, and it might not all be coming from Ontario. It might not all be regional. When it ends up in ground beef or something, most abattoirs don't really have a way of knowing where it came from. So that said, there's some real significant changes that are happening in Ontario around that. So VG Meats is a great case where they are actually doing full traceability on their meat down to which farm it came from, and they're working only with regional producers. They're a provincial abattoir. They're not federal, so it's all focused on regional, and they have a great website with videos where you can go and take a tour of their facility. So that's a really good example. Another one is that we are actually the local food and farm co-op network. We're working on a regional beef labeling initiative in Northwest Ontario, which is so important because a lot of Northwest Ontario meat has been actually going across the border to the US for processing because there wasn't a good way to process it in Northwest Ontario. So then it was coming back from the US. So it was not, you know, it wasn't a very good system. So we're looking at actually building up the whole regional beef infrastructure in Northwest Ontario, and then being able to say, yes, this is Northwest Ontario beef.
Mary? Oh, were you done?
Yep, I'm done.
Okay. I was going to say, Mary got back and just clarified. She said that she was wondering, dense plantings are often seen as an enabler for pest outbreaks. So
Right.
are areas that have a high concentration of invasive species, do they still plant densely? And does that impact yields?
I think that's a really good question. I know a lot of work is going on in the Holland Marsh, where things are planted in sort of fairly conventional sort of agriculture, but to figure out how to deal with the tendencies of pests to go where things are either monocropped or densely planted. So one of the things they found out, for instance, was that rather than using pesticides on the carrots in the Holland Marsh, they could use cutters actually to trim off a few of the fronds, which opens up the plant a bit. And when you've got it more open to the wind, it's less likely to have a pest infestation. So the other thing is with those very dense plantings of apples that you were seeing, again, they're going in and trimming them so they're actually quite open to the wind. So they would be addressing that. But it's a really good question because if you look at permaculture and other kinds of diverse planting, one of the advantages of doing a very diverse farm or garden is that the pests can't really find their way around as easily, so they're not likely to wipe out an entire crop.
And would that be a type of integrated pest management then?
Yeah, integrated pest management is where you're trying to reduce the use of chemicals and using things like cutting the fronds on carrots, or you know what they do in organic farms is just like hand squishing the potato beetles. So it can come to that. That's pretty sustainable.
Yes, it sounds labor intensive. We did have another question too. They're just rolling in. Within your work, have you ever dealt with alternative protein farming, such as cricket or mealworms?
I haven't, but I think it's a really important question. I mean, I think it's certainly coming. It has been part of traditional diets in many parts of the world. We're not, North America, we're not as familiar with it. But it is a very it's a reasonable thing to start thinking about. It's going to be lower on the food chain than large livestock like beef or sheep. The one thing I think is important is to go back to the principles I was talking about. So whatever it is you're growing, I think it's important to think about it being in a resilient ecosystem, which is balanced and complex and diverse. So not doing factory farming of crickets, but trying to keep it along the principles that I was talking about, so that it's still resilient production.
And there are a few cricket farms I'm familiar with operating in Ontario. They are much smaller at this point.
Yeah, yeah.
I was going to say, I think the intro right now people have is selling cricket or mealworms as a flour, so that way you can kind of like top up your porridge or something.
Yep.
So you're not looking at it when you eat it, which I think is a barrier the first time through.
Yeah. They're pretty tasty. They're kind of crunchy.
Okay, put some barbecue flavor in on that. We did have another question too. This one's from Sarah. She works with the York Region Public Health Nutrition Services. Her question essentially is, part of the work she does is looking to promote local agriculture and food procurement, but there's concerns about barriers for those smaller local farms to have the ability to produce year-round and in the quantities that are required. Mm-hmm. Are there any solutions to those types of problems?
Yeah, so as a network of Ontario co-ops, this is one of the things we look at, which would be cooperative food hubs, where regional producers could aggregate together in order to have enough production capacity to meet increased demand. It also allows, if farmers work together like that, it also allows them to have a diversity of products, which means it's easier for them to get to a market. So you can have, somebody's doing apples and fruit and things like that, but somebody else doing the greens, and so that you end up with the customers being able to buy from a larger choice. And the food hubs have become particularly important in the U.S. There's hundreds of them now, and they are being used to bring back local food and agriculture.
Okay, so it's kind of like this capacity building takes time as well. So you can start promoting, and it seems like if part of the issue is growing things year round, it's also a promotion of what's in season probably too, right? So
yeah,
you don't get strawberries in September.
And it also, another thing for Sarah, there's a couple of things. The Golden Horseshoe Food and Farming Alliance has actually been doing significant work on public procurement and how that can work. So you might want to look or contact them, look at their resources, because they've been working with hospitals and things to talk about how they could do that. And the other thing is, because you're in the York region, you're really right next to one of the most productive areas in Canada, and very diverse. I think there's 200 agricultural products that come out of that area. So part of the problem is just making the links. And when I talk to farmers in that area in Holland Marsh and York region and Simcoe, part of what they say is, well, we're exporting partly because we don't know how to get to the regional markets. So some of this is just really changing the way we think the food system has to be done.
Okay. We did have another question. This one was on the role of genetically modified organisms in reducing environmental impacts. So would a genetically modified seed, that requires less water, are there other options there where you plant a genetically modified organism to reduce your impact?
What's happened mostly with the genetically modified plants is that they haven't really been able to live up to the hopes for that. It seems like a lot of the research shows that they may work initially to reduce the need for pesticides and things like that, but that the ecosystem shifts, and again, you need to be using chemicals. So they don't solve the problem long term. GMOs of genetically modified plants have also had a serious problem in that they've produced super weeds, which means that they have, you may put in a genetically modified plant which is resistant to a chemical that you want to use, and which doesn't necessarily mean that less of the chemical is used, but you would hope that it would mean it was less used. But the use of that chemical then becoming a regular thing has meant that there are now super weeds that have come up that are resistant to that chemical that weren't resistant before. So there's an environmental impact. I mean, in my mind, actually, the danger of putting these genetically modified organisms into the environment is bigger than the health danger. That's very worrisome. So I think we have to be careful. The problem is that they are tested in a lab environment, and they're not tested in these complex global ecosystems that I've been talking about. So they don't always know what's going to happen once they're out there around in the fields.
Okay. We did also have a question about permaculture model and Ontario. Is that model being used in farms in Ontario, or is it still something that's kind of in its infancy?
No, I think there's quite a bit of permaculture here. I know that there's courses, even like week-long courses in it.
Okay, so it is currently being used. It might just be on a smaller scale generally.
Yeah, it's not usually on a full farm scale, but I think that's changing as well.
Okay. So this idea would be they taking the principles of a permaculture model and applying it to larger scale. What sort of principles would those be? Just for anyone unfamiliar with the model.
Permaculture uses a diversity of planting, different heights, lots of perennials. So fruit trees, perennial herbs, and things like that. Carefully coordinated so that the plants that are able to, beans and things like that can put nutrients back into the soil, are mixed in with the plants which are nutrient hungry, like tomatoes.
Okay.
So and they tend, permaculture. It's a whole sort of philosophy and theory of how to grow food in an ecosystem, and it's much more like a wild ecosystem. So a lot of different kinds of plants mixed in together and working together. It's very exciting. I try to do it in my backyard garden.
Okay. We did also have a question. You mentioned several incentives to reduce footprints through the presentation. Are there motivators to help companies or farmers act upon those? And would many of them not reduce efficiency at the farm level?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So the first incentive that I can mention is the ALICE program, Alternative Land Use Services, which is now all over Southern Ontario, which actually pays farmers to do things like use wetlands to control the water rather than draining it into ditches. So that's a financial incentive right there. I think the other incentive, which farmers are starting to realize more and more, and it's really the farmers who have to figure this out and test it, is that a lot of these things like integrated pest management or managing your water so that it doesn't create gullies in your field are actually going to have a positive impact on your bottom line, because your land will be in better shape. You're going to be keeping the nutrients more. You're going to be keeping your topsoil more. So what I said about covering, at this point, like I've looked at some of the statistics on what people are doing right now, and it's a very high percentage of farmers are using cover crops now, because a lot of the cover crops like clover or buckwheat actually put nutrients into the soil, which means when you start at the beginning of the season in the spring, you don't have to add as much. You don't have to use fertilizers as much or chemicals, because the soil is already healthy and strong. So it depends, and like I said, I think it's up to the agricultural sector is the ones that are testing this. Like Holland Marsh has a research station where they're testing things. A lot of them are ways to reduce the use of chemicals, and most farmers don't want to use chemicals, so they don't have to, because they're expensive, and most of them come from the US, so that makes them even more expensive.
Okay. This one, you might not have it handy, but maybe you could also just recommend somewhere to go. But we've mentioned a few times like eating closer to the sun to reduce your impact. Do you have any statistics or sources to go to for statistics on the impact of going vegetarian?
Yeah, there's lots of information out there. I saw some from the Food Climate Research Network. Sustain in the United Kingdom has material that's useful. David Suzuki Foundation in Canada. So a lot of it you'll see is the impact that not going plant-based is having, but you can there's also estimates of what it would mean if we each had one meat-free day a week, or if we went. I know that some people, go vegan for a week, and you can calculate what effect that would be if, say, 20% of Ontario did that. There's some very good research also showing on how we could, if we shifted our diet slightly, so we're like 10% towards plant-based and towards more seasonal, what a positive effect that would have on Ontario's economy, our health, and the planet in general.
Okay. And just in line with talking about extra resources external to this webinar, we did have a question about, do you have any material you could share on creating one of these food hubs you were discussing?
Yes, you can contact me. My contact information is up there. We did a whole project on the development of food hubs. I have tons of resources. There's great resources in the U.S. that the National Good Food Network has a lot of information. I mean, you have to factor in the fact that the U.S. there's denser population, so the food hubs are a little different. But I have feasibility studies. If you want to get one started, I'm happy to send you stuff.
All right, excellent. So I'm just going back through, and I think we've hit all the questions that were outstanding. Just as a quick note, I did want to mention Pam sent some interesting information over mentioning about the insects as a food source, about a company that's growing soldier fly larvae, but specifically to feed to fish. Mm-hmm. So it's supporting the food chain, just not directly through people, but still reducing impact because you're not necessarily feeding those fish other fish.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
There was a question about the effect on the health of the caribou.
Oh, yeah. Do you have that information?
Well, what I was going to say, I mean, the material that I've seen, the problem is that the more stressed an animal is, it's because the way it works for the caribou is that they are they're pregnant as they make the migration, so that anything that adds to their stress is inevitably going to affect their health as they go through birthing or anything else. I mean, and part of what, I didn't go into all of it. You can look up caribou. There's a lot of other effects, which is that their food sources are also being reduced, so that when they do get where they usually spend the time with the calves, there may be less food there. So this is when you see things about the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, that's connected to this problem for what's happening with the caribou.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much. So then we're 2 minutes out. So I'm going to say that this is probably all the time we have. Thank you, Sally, for joining and sharing.
My pleasure.
And so this session, like I mentioned, will be recorded. We'll post it online, and I can shoot you guys a quick message when it goes up. If you want to see any of the previous webinars, those are all recorded and posted in French and English. I'd also like to mention that Enbridge helped us support this webinar and the program in general. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and let me know. And thanks so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you all.